Merci beaucoup, Florian, et bonjour à tous. Je suis vraiment très honorée et touchée, je dois dire, d'être associée au centre lorsque l'invitation m'est venue, oui, il y a environ 2 ans, de jouer ce rôle de praticienne en résidence. J'ai été tout à fait séduite pour 2 raisons. D'abord parce que j'aimais beaucoup ce pont que la faculté construit entre l'université et la pratique. Et deuxièmement, parce que je crois profondément en la démarche multidisciplinaire que le centre met de l'avant. When you think that the center is 15 years old, but the focus on the intersection of law, technology, and society at the University of Ottawa is 25 years old. I mean, like, that's before Facebook. That's before Amazon Web Services. And 15 years ago, that vision that was already in advance led to the creation of the center. I mean, that's before Tinder. That's before TikTok. And yet, we see now, every day, this intersection. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada yesterday was testifying on S209 on the protection of children online. Intersection of society, law, and technology. I mean, it is a phenomenon. Children are going online. That is not just a legal issue. It is not just a technological issue. It is not just a social issue, and it has to be looked at together. In my practice, I see it all the time because companies bring to me all these solutions, technological solutions that they want to apply or that they actually develop. And every time, I am pushed not just on the application of the law, but also on the social impact. I'm going, is our society ready for this? Like a camera that has artificial intelligence solution that doesn't just film, it analyzes movement and calls it suspect if indeed that's what the algorithm produces, which sends a security guard on the poor person who was so designated as suspect. Are we ready for that? So again, as a lawyer, I feel that I have to take all that into account. Look at the program before the House of Commons right now. Bill C2. Bill C2 is confronting us to technological capacity. Yes, if you want to spy on people, you can do that really well right now. As a society, do we want that? But then, how do we transpose the rule of law on the internet while still protecting human rights? So I really give you all these examples because they bring to life the mission of the center. And that's why I'm so proud that I was invited to be practitioner in residence here. Et on m'a également demandé de présenter le panel. Je me sens aussi tout à fait à l'aise étant une ancienne fonctionnaire pendant 27 ans. Et je voudrais donc partager avec vous les noms et les titres des personnes qui vont maintenant discuter de la question. Donc, nous avons Loris Mirella, qui est directeur de la division de la propriété intellectuelle, de l'économie numérique et de l'innovation aux Affaires mondiales, Director Intellectual Property, Digital Economy and Innovation Division at Global Affairs Canada. Amy Awad, qui est directrice générale, cadre du marché numérique et créatif patrimoine canadien, Director General, Digital and Creative Marketplace Frameworks at Canadian Heritage, as well as Oline Twiss, commissaire adjointe du Bureau du Commissariat à la protection de l'information de la vie privée de la Colombie-Britannique, Deputy Commissioner, Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia. I was at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada for nearly 6 years, so I certainly relate to that role. Anthony McIntyre, avocat général principal et vice-président des services juridiques au Conseil de la radiodiffusion des télécommunications canadiennes, so Senior General Counsel and Vice President Legal Services at the CRTC. et Talita Nabali, qui est directrice générale des services juridiques au bureau du Conseil privé, so Director of Legal Services for the Privy Council of Canada. So really, I think you're in very good hands, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm sure everyone feels the same way. My name is Loris Morella. I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. It's not on. Is it on now? Oh, okay. Hygiene issues. Okay. So we're speaking today about the perspective of government in relation to the theme identified, and I had a lot of flashbacks through the morning so far already. I was already thinking back to the early days of working in the government when private copying was a big deal when I was working in policy, and I had a well-thumbed copy of the Information Highway Advisory Council report on my desk that I referred to a lot. So, you know, a lot of the reference points are a little different, but the challenges are the same, and I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say, especially now with new technologies coming up that will lead us to face some of these questions again, such as artificial intelligence. But for our purposes, we organized ourselves to try and address and present things through 3 guiding questions. Thanks, Oline, for putting those together. So I'll just say the questions and then we'll speak to each one in turn. So first is, what is the most valuable contribution or impact that government or regulators make on shaping technology? The second question, what kind of contributions or impacts do you find as a government representative? Do you find valuable from other groups that are invited here today, so in terms of academia, civil society, private practice, and industry, when it comes to shaping technology in society? And the third question will be, if there's one lesson from the past 25 years of shaping technology to bring forward to the next 25 years, what would it be and why? So we're going to organize ourselves in that respect. So the first question is, what kind of contribution impact do you find valuable or most valuable from, what is the most valuable contribution impact that governments or regulators can make to shaping technology? And you're going to hear a range of views. So we have representatives. Government is quite large, so you have everyone from regulators that operate at arm's length, which would, in the kind of cosmology, are probably a little bit on the periphery, all the way to the center of legislation and regulation. We have a representative from the Privy Council office. So, and you'll hear everything in between as well. So for the first question, I'm going to turn to Anthony first, and then everyone can jump in on what is the most valuable contribution impact that government as regulators can make to shaping society.
Okay, how's the volume? Is that okay? Okay, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I am a graduate of the University of Ottawa Common Law program, although I did not participate in the tech law program at the time. I was very much focused on taking as many corporate law, tax law, competition law classes sprinkled in. And of course, I ended up getting a job at a private law firm where I was the corporate law associate. And I spent probably 90% of my time in data rooms doing due diligence on very boring transactions, and had an opportunity to work in my last rotation for a number of lawyers who did communications law at the time. And my eyes just opened up to the world of, or the intersection of policy, technology, and law, which is, you know, communications law, and that's where I work. I've been at the CRTC since 2007, so it's been a while. I did take 5 years in between to work for the regulator for financial institutions, so another regulator. So regulation very much is something that I've worked in for my whole career. But it really is just an amazing opportunity today to be here with all of you, and I do thank Marina for for inviting me and sort of making me feel part of this really amazing community over the last few years. So thank you. I think maybe I could start just a little bit with an explanation for what the CRTC is and what our role is as a regulator of communications. And I know that all of you are involved in technology issues to some extent, but many of you are not probably necessarily familiar with the CRTC specifically. So what we are, what our role is to act as an arm's length administrative tribunal where we regulate telecommunications in the broadcasting sectors, among a few other things, but primarily for these purposes, those key industries. And we're set up in such a way so that we will make decisions that sort of core government departments perhaps would rather not make as far as acting in a way that's arm's length, that's evidence-based, that takes submissions received from stakeholders across the board and renders decisions that are in the public interest. And we use the term public interest quite a bit. And when we talk about public interest, it really is a function of the legislation that we administer that sets out very aspirational policy objectives that we seek to further in our decision making. So maybe just, and I know that time is limited, I don't want to go sort of too deep in, and we'll have additional questions, but maybe to come back to the original question about what our role is in shaping technology. So we don't obviously deploy the technology. We use it ourselves, but that's not the role that we play in this ecosystem. We're there to advance the public interest and to attempt to amplify the positive effects of technology and to minimize the negative effects. And one of the sort of themes that I've certainly picked up on over the days so far has been complexity. And we certainly operate in a very complex environment as far as administering our legislation to regulate these technologies. And I'll give you sort of one example just to sort of illustrate that. One of the things that we do is we regulate the wholesale access of internet services. So one of the things that I always get sort of asked at maybe functions like this is, you're the regulator for communications. Why are my cell phone bills so high? Why are my internet services so pricey? Heard it many times, and I think the answer is often, well, it's actually very complicated as far as how those decisions get made. And in the context of this particular decision, this decision was one that we rendered to create a regime where companies could receive access to wholesale internet services provided by the sort of big incumbents. And this is a process that spanned hundreds of submissions, an oral hearing, and a decision that was very much contested multiple times over the course of several years. And this is maybe an example that I might come back to as far as explaining the kind of complexity of the world within which we operate as the regulator. That's it for now.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. My name's Oline Twiss, and I am Deputy Commissioner at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia. And I am here today because I had the good fortune many years ago to take one of the Law Society of Ontario's public interest articling positions at CIPIC, with David Fewer over there as my principal. So similarly, I feel very honored to be part of this event today. I think it's a really wonderful idea to stop, take a breath, think about the last 25 years and think about the next 25 years, and what an incredible network of people in this room. I look forward to chatting with as many of you as I can before the day is through. Without getting into too much more detail, I will say that our office, also an arm's length regulator, the Information and Privacy Commissioner in British Columbia, is accountable to the Legislative Assembly, not to a minister of the government. And in our function, we have oversight over public bodies and organizations across the province of British Columbia on access to information and on privacy matters. So one thing I want to talk about in this question about the most valuable contribution, at least from a regulatory perspective, is we have the ability in our work to take a look at what is happening in quite a bit of detail with emerging technologies. We look at the detail of all sorts of things, but emerging technologies is certainly one of those areas. And the commissioner's mandate includes an authority to engage in commissioner-initiated investigations, through which we're very often looking at very common privacy questions, like was consent, use, or disclosure authorized under this relevant statute? Were security safeguards put in place? Those kinds of things. But one of the interesting byproducts of those reports that we do is that we have the opportunity to really lift the veil on how these emerging technologies are being used. At a time where perhaps some of the only people that really understand it are computer scientists or people involved in building the technologies, we can get in there early on and talk in public reports about what is happening. So you may have seen that recently the privacy commissioners across Canada that have jurisdiction over the private sector released a report on TikTok. We talked about children's privacy and that, how personal information is being gathered by the video sharing application. And we also looked at deficiencies in consent. But we've also looked at a variety of other areas of technology, going back to a report on Cadillac Fairview. We looked at cameras in mall kiosks and how they're using facial recognition software to gather information without appropriate consent. We looked at Clearview AI, of course, which was scraping images and doing biometric facial recognition from across the internet. We've looked at retailers and their practices around facial recognition, and also retailer apps like loyalty apps that may be collecting geolocation data inappropriately. So a variety of areas, and in each of our reports, we talk about what actually is happening with these emerging technologies. So I think that as a regulator, we're in many ways uniquely positioned to get information out there about what is happening when we're doing these reports. It is incidental to the reports, but it's useful information because it helps contribute to the public discourse about where do we want to go. And if we're thinking about where we want to go over the next 25 years, I would recommend some of those reports to you to get a sense of what exactly is happening with personal information when it comes to some of these new technologies. The other thing I'll talk about just briefly when it comes to contributions from regulators is, we've heard many times in many iterations, the avocado metaphor being one of them, but it is trite to say like law just does not keep up. It's almost passé. So it is a fast changing field when it comes to new technologies. Privacy is very often implicated in those technologies, and it's forced regulators to come up with innovative ways to weigh in on some of these things. So in addition to some of those commissioner-initiated investigations that I've mentioned, you'll see the commissioners engage in things like publishing joint resolutions on topics, very often very topical topics. Generative AI is one of the most recent, but children's privacy, employee privacy, digital identities, facial recognition, digital healthcare. During COVID, it was the vaccine passports. Commissioners are taking the opportunity to get their views out on things through those resolutions because our systems take so long. So these are ways to weigh in on the public discourse on what some of the issues that are emerging. You'll see the same thing at the international level with the Global Privacy Assembly, doing the same thing with resolutions. And there's another area where we see this happening, which is it's a group called GPEN, which is Global Privacy Regulators around the world, annually does what they call a sweep. They choose a topic every year to look at a particular issue. The most recent one was looking at deceptive design patterns on websites and in apps to get a sense of how often is it very clear for users what is happening with their personal information, and are they being nudged in ways that are not in the interest of their privacy and personal information. And the group of 25 privacy regulators from around the world looked at over 1,000 websites to determine that deceptive design patterns indeed are steering users away from privacy more often than not. Children are often the targets. And it's, again, another way to contribute to the ongoing discourse around some of these issues. So I think it's really the forums like this, the public dialogue that we have across sectors really matter when there's a fast pace of change with emerging technologies. And those are a couple of ways that privacy regulators are jumping in.
Hi, I'm Talitha, and I work at the Privy Council office in the legal services sector. So I'm I came to University of Ottawa to do my law degree, and I had a really good pedigree for the tech law program. My undergrad's in computer science. I had published on, back in the day, the FBI's carnivore program and the legal implications, and that's what made me come to law school. So I had a really good plan for my career, and I was going to be a tech law lawyer. I did a privacy moot with Marina. It was really awesome in Chicago. I got to be an RA for Professors Chandler and Professor Daniel Gervais. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then I guess my career plans stopped, and I never really worked in technology law ever again. So I graduated. So I guess my moral here is if you want to work in tech law, have a better career plan than me, but I am employed and my job's fun. So even if you don't have a good career plan, you might still get to do cool things. So over the past couple years, although I have not worked in tech law ever since law school, I have got to see some of the tech law adjacent issues 17 years after graduation. I worked at Canadian Heritage Legal Services before PCO Legal Services, and there I got to work on the modernization of the Broadcasting Act, as well as the Online News Act. And more recently at PCO Legal Services, we've done the public inquiry into foreign interference, and out of that there were some recommendations, including related to disinformation and misinformation. So we get to work on that with our democratic institutions client. We also have housed, before the last election, the Artificial Intelligence Secretariat and support the Artificial Intelligence Deputy Secretary. And now that's moved to ISED, but it was still interesting while it resided with us. And also, you may have seen over the past couple weeks the announcement from the Prime Minister relating to the Major Projects Office. The Major Projects Office is housed at PCO, and obviously most of the projects that are announced are resource or development projects, but there was something of interest. The Prime Minister did talk about artificial intelligence sovereignty and building up the AI factories that are necessary to do that. And so it's interesting now that we're seeing sort of the major projects, including tech law projects. In terms of a view from central agency, I think that even though the government is always seen as being kind of behind in terms of technology, it does yield a lot of power. It has a lot of influence. It has a lot of money. It can support industry with monetary infusions. It can also legislate when it wants, what it wants. I mean, within reason, obviously, we've seen some problems with the government minorities over the past couple of years, but usually it can do so within very limits, constitutional limits, for instance. But government is very privileged and can really push the needle. So that's what I have to say, notwithstanding my failed career in tech law.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to my colleagues. I won't take too much time realizing this was one of 3 questions and we're almost halfway done. I had the privilege of attending the University of Ottawa as well, both for my common law degree and then a few years later for a master in NLM in law and technology. I'm not sure that at any point while I was a student, I was certain that I was interested in a career in law and technology, but it kind of caught up with me later on. So the last 8 years specifically of my career, I've been working for Canadian Heritage in different policy roles. And so I've had an opportunity to participate in the kind of government policy development for things, some of the things that Talitha mentioned. So the modernization of the Broadcasting Act, the Online News Act, the policy development for online harms, the kind of work that we've been doing on copyright, as well as kind of overseeing some of the trade-related and foreign investment-related issues that are kind of adjacent to all of this. And when I think about what is kind of the most valuable contribution the government or regulators can make to technology, I think the obvious answer is, well, you set the frameworks, right? You're the ones that set the laws, those regulatory frameworks. But I mean, as somebody that's now for several years been involved in the development, I think my thinking tends to kind of fluctuate between kind of cynicism and optimism, because even though we do see some framework legislation coming out, sometimes it takes a long time for that to happen. It can be slow. Sometimes it doesn't go far enough to actually achieve the objectives that it seeks to achieve. And so there's a certain amount of cynicism about actually the government being able to play this kind of significant and valuable role in shaping technology. I think over time have overcome that cynicism with a bit of optimism. And that's because I think I've come to realize that a lot of the work that government does through that process of policy development actually has impacts, even if they're not as visible in terms of the outcomes, right? So even if there's no new program that funds some development, or there's no new regulatory framework that's in place, or the new legislation, a lot of the work that government does actually has impact. And so I think about that impact in terms of the convening power. So those consultations, those discussions that the government puts together, they force groups to listen to each other that otherwise may not have had the incentive to do so. And they help in framing the issues for discussion. So that framing actually impacts the way that technology develops. And so what I really found is that even without those final regulations or that program that you can then measure the impact of, there is actually processes that change the way that technology and companies work. And I give a couple of recent examples of things where there's no visible immediate outcomes. So over the past 4 or 5 years, the government has been involved in a very developed consultation process on online harms regulation, right? So there was public consultation papers and many roundtables and expert advisory groups that were convened, and a public forum that was held. So I think in terms of government consultation practice, a really developed process, but we still don't have any online harms regulation or legislation in place. I don't think that doesn't mean that over those years there hasn't been changes and adjustment to the practices of companies just arising from that activity. And of course, there may still be things to come in the future. And I see that a little bit in terms of discussions that have occurred recently around copyright and generative AI. So, we've gone through in the past couple of years public consultations on copyright and generative AI, and it would be easy for somebody to say, okay, well, that's just a waste of government money. There was a lot of talk, papers were published, but nothing happened. And that's, I think that's not necessarily true. There are changes, industrial changes, development of markets that starts to occur when those discussions are happening, even if you don't see the outcomes. So I guess my bottom line from my observation on this first question is that even when no formal rules follow, government engagement creates a backdrop of accountability, public interest, and responsibility that does have a kind of a shaping role in technology, even if it's sometimes difficult to point to exactly.
Thank you very much. That was very illuminating. And I'm going to pick up on some of Amy's point on the second question. So what kind of contributions do you find valuable from the other groups that are going to be presenting today when it comes to shaping technology in society? And so I'd like to start by just and picking up a little bit with the first question, because I think what the government does is provide the resources for being able to frame questions in the first place. Sometimes it's a amorphous kind of situation, or it's hard to see where the legal framework is going to begin. But going back to my experience with the information highway and the early internet, it was quite remarkable trying to come up with the starting point, and so we drafted I was part of the group that drafted the first paper for Copyright in the Digital Era. That was the basis then for, so it was kind of a green paper, white paper that was the basis for written submissions. And then it was the basis, we did a report on that, and then we went out across the country and we did face-to-face consultations through roundtables. We also had a sort of a retreat with academics, and Michael, you were part of that, to try and understand what the questions that we should be asking were in the first place to be able to frame, how policy might develop. And so that led ultimately to a couple of versions of a copyright bill, Bill C-60 and Bill C-61, that came out in the 2005 around there. But as part of that, we also did some work with the private sector and with academics. There was a paper that, again, I helped oversee on technological protection measures that some people in the room, Professor Marchat and others, Ian Kerr, were involved in. And I was looking it up recently, and it's called an influential paper now on the internet. So congratulations. But it just showed that, the kinds of resources and maybe the patience or the long view that is part of being able to not just form policy, but form the questions that everyone can then engage with or as you try and work your way through. But at any rate, that's just my take on the second question. So maybe we'll start with Oline on this one.
Yeah, I'll just talk about a couple of things. The first one, and maybe it's building a little bit on what you were talking about, but I find that we had a panel this morning from academics, and I find it is, from a regulatory perspective, and I have found this when I worked in the House of Commons and in other spaces, and U of O, for whatever reason, I don't know what's in the water, but is particularly exceptional at this. But academics that are putting their analyses out there online in a manner that's not just available to you as a regulator, but to everybody in the public. It's incredibly helpful, in particular when it's responsive to whatever is happening that day or that week. These are things that really inform what's happening in debates around policy development or where to prioritize resources. I know that a lot of other sectors jump into similar things as well. We have the ability through social networking to be able to do that in really proficient ways. And I find it's a really helpful way to keep dialogues going. Another thing that we like from the privacy regulatory perspective is when people come to us with consultations. So our office and many privacy commissioners across the country have policies on consultations where, even though we also have the oversight and enforcement hat, we're also available for folks to come and consult with us prior to rolling something out, or when they're thinking of rolling something out and they want to help or have input from the regulator on how to shape it. So those consultations have been very, very helpful. And industry actors or private sector actors or public sector actors that come to us and engage in those consultations, we think it's a terrific way to help shape policy. And we've seen emerge in other jurisdictions, things like regulatory sandboxes, where there are a defined set of rules for how those engagements will happen. And I think they're really important for shaping the future of technology.
So again, my role is a bit different. At a central agency, a lot of the work that we do is issues management, but we also support in terms of cabinet decision making and prime minister decision making. And I think in government, a lot of times people think that maybe they haven't been heard or ideas have been ignored. But I have to say, in seeing how cabinet decision making and prime minister decision making happens, all the work and all the thought that has happened for numerous years before a policy decision is made is in fact before the decision maker. And even if at the outcome, those who participated don't see it, it was there and it was debated and it is very longly outlined in memorandum to cabinet in other ways. So I think the work is really important to get to what the government thinks is the right policy outcome. And without all those perspectives, I think the end government policies would not be as good as they are, even though obviously they can be criticized and may not be exactly the way many of the stakeholders wish them to be.
I guess maybe just to echo what Olene and Talitha just said about, I guess both the ways in which, in my case, the CRTC as a regulator appreciates or depends on actually comments and submissions from various stakeholders, but then also the point of that the decisions themselves truly do take into account all of the input. As far as the CRTC specifically, we are really designed to accommodate and to facilitate submissions in many different forms. So we have quite a sort of wide variety of processes that are quite flexible. And if you're an everyday Canadian who has an opinion about what the definition of Canadian content should be, for example, to pick an example that's timely at this point, you can simply write on an online form to provide your opinion about that. To the other end of the spectrum, where sophisticated parties will, write very sort of complex submissions with expert evidence and have that considered as well. So there is sort of a wide spectrum of ways to do that, and I guess the process within a tribunal is very similar to other government decision-making processes where that information is absolutely reviewed and analyzed by teams of staff who will then synthesize that into briefing documents. And then I guess at the sort of tail end of that is the decision, which will necessarily reflect that input as well. So that sort of element of transparency and accountability is certainly critical to our work at the Commission.
Thank you very much. And recognizing that we're short of time, but we do have, we'll have a quick round for the third question, which I think lends itself to being briefer anyway. So if there's one lesson to carry forward from the past 25 years, what would that be and why? And I'm going to start off with Amy because I had the benefit of looking at all the answers, and I thought it was intriguing that she started with the word trust. So Amy, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that.
Sure, absolutely. I don't think we're usually that brief on anything that we say, but we can always try. So I think that if I had been asked this question like 15 years ago, so around the time that I was here, when the center was being formed, I would have said probably the biggest challenge, the biggest problem we need to solve is a timing problem. The rate of kind of acceleration of technology compared to the ability of society and democratic processes to respond is just such a big mismatch, and it's only getting bigger. And that is the problem that we need to solve. Otherwise, we'll be kind of always kind of wagging the dog, this addressing, trying to catch up with what is essentially technological determinism. 15 years later, I actually don't think that's the problem anymore. So my thinking has evolved. And I actually think that the bigger lesson and the bigger focus that we need in the next 15 years relates to trust and predictability. And so I think that what I'm coming to realize, or what I've come to realize, is that no matter how quickly technology is evolving, it's not evolving more quickly than we can predict and anticipate and conceptualize it, because technology isn't evolving on its own. It's people that are developing it, and other people, from historians and science fiction writers and others, are able to anticipate and predict many of the most important societal impacts that are coming. So it's not like we're getting caught off guard. We do have the ability to move at the same pace of technology. But to do that, our society or our kind of democratic organizational community processes need to be kind of on par, and that requires trust. And like kind of trust in each other, trust in our institutions, all those kind of different measures of trust. And so if we have that in place, the pace of technology is not the problem. But if technology is eroding that trust, then there'll be no way to keep that. Then we'll kind of lose the battle already. And so like maybe the lesson or the lens that we could take for the next 25 years is to be focusing on trust. So how do we build it? How do we sustain it? And that's both from a first principles perspective, like that trust means transparency, it means kind of ethical action and so forth, but also to realize that sometimes those first principles aren't enough, because certain technology is really their main focus and the main area, or the main area where they attack societies in terms of trust. And so we need to be a little bit more sophisticated in terms of how we address risks to trust as maybe the existential risk, as opposed to kind of other risks that can be dealt with more easily once we have or are able to kind of rebuild that trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to work backwards to Talitha, because I think it'll be interesting to juxtapose with all the work you're doing on artificial intelligence and how that might apply.
Okay, so this is my own view. I just want to start by saying that. So right now, I think there's a large push. Obviously, we've seen with the creation of a Minister for Artificial Intelligence, et cetera, that artificial intelligence will solve a lot of the government's problems. I don't think it's as realistic as maybe the government thinks, but there's going to continue to be a push to find technological ways to allow the government to continue to serve and perhaps better serve the Canadian population, which is growing, without increasing the public service, and to find efficiency. So I think that what's really important for the next 25 years, or even like right now, but continuing to be, is that as the government tries to harness this new technology in order to be a better, smaller, more efficient government, with AI, automation, or otherwise, it needs to consider first and foremost the accountability for the use of that technology. It also needs to ensure that it adheres to its legal obligations, including procedural fairness, including valid and reliable decisions, including information and privacy being respected and secured. It also needs to make sure that its outcomes are fair for everybody, efficient, and not discriminatory. And I think that's a lot. And it also has to be in the forefront of the decision making. You can't just have efficiency without considering all the other implications. The government should be a leader. And as a leader, it can influence the rest of society as well.
When I thought back to 25 years ago, the first thing I thought about was Y2K. And I don't know if, I mean, my memory of it was essentially a small handful of people understood what was going on, but for the most part, most people did not. And we all just at the toll of midnight kind of hoped it would work out. And I really hope that that's not how we're going to go into agentic AI or other emerging technologies that are bringing some of the challenges before us. So I agree with both of you. I think it really is about going back to first principles, making sure we have a common sense of what they are, but also have some really key safeguards in place to help mitigate risk. Essentially, I think that's at the core of it. And the other thing that I would mention, somebody said this morning, there's about 10 different ways that people are throwing around the phrase data sovereignty. Maybe the most recent one has to do with our neighbor to the south, but there's all sorts of other ways. And I think we would be remiss to not also be thinking about the emerging very strong discussion about Indigenous data sovereignty and the challenges that that poses to our very individualistic conceptions of personal information, and how we're going to start thinking about that and working that into our discussions and the principles that we have, because we're in the middle of a national discussion as well on truth and reconciliation, and we certainly will need to be taking account of that.
These are real tough acts to follow, I've got to say. Very great points. I mean, I guess my perspective is very similar in that the technology obviously is changing very fast. And as a regulator, there's a real necessity to try to keep up and to adapt our frameworks to respond to not just the technology, but in the case of a regulator, an economic regulator, the changing market dynamics and ensuring that those public policy objectives are being sort of advanced on an ongoing basis, which falls back to timely decision making, but then also monitoring and adjusting where appropriate. But certainly concepts such as trust and democratic involvement, stakeholder engagement, those are critical to sort of ensuring that we get it right as much as we can.
And from my perspective, I think just building on those as well, the lesson I would take is that, and just going back to the sense of urgency, but not urgency necessarily. I mean, there's importance of being curious, being willing to engage, being patient. One of my colleagues, I remember many years ago, said, "The house is always on fire, but it never burns down." Like it's just this way things are. So that's the lesson that I took from that. And you don't always put up a sign yet, but I know we're getting late. Just to close off then, thank you very much to all the panelists. And so we want to leave some time for questions. So we'll take that as the stopping point and turn it over to you for any questions and comments.
Yes, I'm Eric Ward. Thank you. That was a really excellent panel. And people have made this question, this point about pacing and the avocado metaphor. I'm really going to take that away. But my sense is that there's actually often a lot of public law that is not public, that is very contemporaneous, but that it's covered by solicitor-client privilege, and having been in the solicitor-client privilege zone in government, it makes me wonder whether our zealousness about maintaining that core principle of privilege is in a way getting in our way of building trust. Sometimes if people saw the care and the diligence that was taken in devising a strategy that led to a certain deployment of a certain technology in law enforcement or something else, it might, or if we were able to communicate a little bit about that, there might be a little bit more trust. But we're very zealous about guarding that privilege. And of course, there's always litigation. So you don't want to say how reasonable you're being because you don't want to be forced to be that reasonable. Can you, first of all, do you agree that this we're in a pinch, partly because of privilege, and that maybe there's an awful lot of good law taking place that that people don't have access to. And second, is there a way that we might be able to relax or work with that better in order to engage more broadly to allow for a faster paced exchange on the legal issues? I'm thinking about the charter, the charter statements the Department of Justice made now that, was kind of mind blowing, but we're able to do that, and we've managed to work that out in a way that's consistent with privilege. So over to you.
Letha, here.
So I think that's a huge debate currently, solicitor-client privilege. There's obviously Supreme Court case law, which says it's forever, and there's a bunch of people who are in that ballpark, but I think the needle is changing. Policy makers versus lawyers in government have different views. I think it's exciting, I would say, that debate currently in the government. I would say that there are very strong, influential forces who may agree with the principles that you set out as to why it should change. And I think that there may be a policy change that might be different from the legal status quo in the next few years, which may open things up. I think there are a lot of big policy thinkers who do think that this might be better for government long term, but obviously we'll see. That it's not there yet, but it's definitely an exciting area, and it's not just the legal minds that are thinking about that. It's really a holistic government and really senior officials who are thinking about these issues.
It's a small addition. It's not specifically about solicitor-client privilege, but I think about the issue more generally of like government being able to be transparent about the work that they're doing and the thought that they're giving to I think it's an important driver of trust. I've had the privilege to work for the past couple of years as part of the multi-stakeholder group for multi-stakeholder kind of consultation group for the Open Government Partnership. And I think that this issue, it goes beyond solicitor-client privilege. The inability for government to communicate about a lot of the, processes and the work that's done before decisions are announced, before policy is announced, I think does impact public trust. So I think this idea of trying to find ways to kind of rebalance or find new balances in terms of what can be shared publicly and when is one of the ingredients in terms of rebuilding trust in government.
Thank you. Thanks. It's very likely that new public bodies will be created in the upcoming years to govern tech. As insiders, what are the good practices and the bad practices that we should be on the lookout for when studying these bills to ensure that we have working public bodies, agencies, arm's length regulators?
I can come in first, and then, of course, if others might have other things to add. So I think when we look internationally, and even as we were planning, for example, for a former bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, I think some of the practices that we felt were good. I mean, the idea of having a certain degree of independence from government is important, so that our arm's length nature is important. And I think building a little bit on what was said during the civil society panel, I think independence from government, independence from sometimes the regulated industries and with which they're working is important as well, especially when you think of like regulators that are funded through fees from the entities that they regulate. I think specialization is becoming more important. So maybe in the past it was, the same people or the same groups of people could work at different regulators. They understood how regulation worked. More and more now you need kind of specialized processes and expertise in the areas that you're working in. I think a good practice is to have kind of general principles set out in legislation and have kind of a variety of regulatory tools, including kind of real enforcement powers with your regulator. I think that's another good practice. And the ability of regulators to communicate and work together. So regulators in different spheres to work together, or at least are some of kind of the good practices that I could share right now.
Yeah, I would echo those sentiments, and also just going up to the 10,000-foot level. I think we're really fortunate in Canada because we have figured out some things about the importance of independent regulators. In some cases, we haven't quite figured out the importance of order-making powers, but hopefully we'll get there. And in a world where we see increasing polarization all around us, we really ought not to take for granted our democratic institutions. They are extremely valuable to us. The ability to have people with an independent mandate to take a look at what government's doing and to work at arm's length from industry and to hear from all sorts of groups is really something that we should be defending at every step and upholding. So it's also through the process of developing those new institutions, identifying when it is necessary to have that independence and when not is something that I'd be looking out for as well.
If we have time, it would be nice to squeeze in I see there's a couple more people.
Thanks. I'll make it as fast as I can. And thank you for this panel. It's been really interesting. My name is Bill Abbott. I'm with TELUS. So almost every panel, at least one person, perhaps more, have said, the law is always behind technology and it's reactive. And I guess my question is that necessarily a bad thing? And two examples come to mind. One is C-27 ADA, which, is a pretty good example of why you shouldn't rush to be first in a race that has no prize for first place. Similarly, the EU AI Act, it was locked and loaded and ready to go. And then Gen AI came out and they had to pull it back and rework it. Conversely, for the people on this panel, what comes to mind for me is PIPEDA and the Telecom Act. They're, relatively speaking, principle-based, technology-neutral, leave room for either government officials or regulators to interpret them and adapt them to time. So the question in all of that, if there's no one answer, as when is it appropriate for law and government to sort of lead technology, and when should it sort of wait, watch, and then follow? Are there sort of two obvious buckets in that?
Well, that's such an easy question. You could have just, I don't know why you even bother asking it. That's like a trite answer, of course. Maybe I mean, obviously I don't have an answer to your question because there's so many different scenarios. I do think that the reason why it's difficult to answer that question is because it's not a situation where, yes, the government should always get ahead, and because if you act early, you could act wrongly. Like you can make mistakes. You can have the ability to anticipate impacts is much more difficult. On the other hand, I mean, especially when we're talking about communications technologies, which is the area where I work in more, the potential for irreversible kind of systems to get put in place also exists if you wait too long, right? So sometimes if you try to introduce regulation too late, maybe companies are already bigger than most countries and can already impact or influence the democratic process in those countries, and it becomes very difficult to then regulate or make interventions or make changes in business models and so forth. So sometimes those early interventions, especially principle-based ones, can be helpful in directing the development of business and technology. And so I think that's the challenge, is to find the answer. And there's no like situation where you can just say we should always just wait or we should always just jump in. It's very kind of fact specific, and it may be like, I think that the best way to look at this is to look at historic examples. When were governments or when was intervention done quickly, and what were the outcomes, and try to see if we can find analogies to the situations that we deal with now.
No one's pulled the mic from my cold dead hand, so please go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, better. But yes, you're saying that perhaps the technological risks to trust are the essential risk right now. And I would like to ask, what would you say some of the ways are that technology is eroding trust, particularly in our institutions, and what are perhaps some of the approaches we should use to try and combat this problem?
Me, not me. So I'll let Amy talk.
Sorry.
It's okay. She's pretty smart, so I don't mind being her for a little bit.
To Amy and to everybody. Yes.
So I think part of there's many different ways that it's happening. Maybe two of the pathways. One of them is in terms of mediating communication between people, and sometimes between institutions and people. So by becoming the mediator and choosing kind of what information and who people talk to, under what circumstances, usually kind of for algorithmic or business reasons, they're impacting the ability of kind of communities and trust to develop between people. So that's, I think, one of the ways. And the other pathway I alluded to a little bit before is that sometimes when technology companies become large and powerful enough and with a broad enough kind of offering of services that affect so many different areas of society, their ability to participate, influence democratic processes, or even lobby, if they want to call that, becomes so strong in so many different places in the world that when it's convenient for them or aligns with their interests, they can impact the trust or ability to engage with governments or other institutions. So I think those are two of the pathways. The solutions are more difficult. So I tried to hint at a couple before, and I said I think part of it does fall to governments themselves or institutions or communities to be excessively transparent, to kind of double down in terms of professional ethics, in terms of ethical behavior, so that they can differentiate themselves in the eyes of the public. And then I added to that, so while those first principles are helpful, they might not be enough, because if that communication, if that transparency is still being kind of mediated through, let's say, a biased filter, then it doesn't really matter what government is doing. People will hear it or see it, understand it differently. And so that's where I think, I don't have a solution. I just know that that's the problem. So I'll leave it there. Maybe others on the panel have suggestions.
When you were speaking, it made me think of actually one of the things that always comes to mind is it's kind of a virtuous circle, like full engagement from civil society and groups are essential to make sure that the record reflects, everything that should be taken into account, and then it's up to the government to make sure that that has been the case. So, thorough consultations, thorough reviews, making full use of the democratic process, including parliamentary committees when it's time for that. Because it makes me think of two examples. I remember back, sometimes you read about a consultation and then there's there was this group that was formed by a stakeholder to artificially present a perspective. And so how should that be treated? So, again, if it's a thorough process, it'll be taken into account appropriately. And the same thing with when there's written submissions. Back in the day, going back to the first copyright consultation, there were hundreds of submissions, but some stakeholders wanted those discounted because there was a form letter. And so a form letter, come on, that's so easy. That's not really an expression of. So it's really a matter of having a view of the whole and making sure that the process is legitimate and thorough, that creates a public record that can be relied on for whatever outcome then is presented. It has to be defendable and withstand, any kind of perceived shortcoming or possibility of being undermined.
Okay, thank you.
And I think I misread the time, but are we still good? 3 more minutes, holy cow. Time for another question, come on. Oh.
Just another one, another easy one to Amy. You mentioned the issue of trust, right, as perhaps the greatest challenge. And I'm wondering to what extent trust itself doesn't rest upon another challenge, which is a challenge of knowledge, and more particularly of informational asymmetry. And the difficulties that governments face increasingly to make sense of reality when information becomes owned, right, and appropriated in ways that make it difficult for governments to understand and anticipate what is going on. So, as we think of AI, as we think of technology progressing faster and faster, right? How can we think of government in, let's say, 10, 20 years in terms of the growing power of technological actors and how to respond to that?
Another very easy question. I think you're right, like that there is an element, or there's definitely an important element of kind of erosion of trust that's connected to information asymmetries. And part of that is like maybe people in the public that don't have access to the same information that governments do, that technology companies do. And over time, it also means governments themselves not having access to information that's more and more kind of, like you said, owned or walled off in different places. I think part of that process of walling off is one where government or society can intervene, like our potential interventions and actions in the areas of AI as we maybe support its adoption, but also try to identify safety risks, can and should be looking at the impacts in terms of information flows and ownership of information and access to information. And considering that a lot of, especially, I would say, like novel or new information is generated either directly by government or by institutions like this one and others that are funded through public funds. I think that thinking about how to ensure that all those public investments don't get appropriated or kind of appropriated or don't become inaccessible, or the outputs don't become inaccessible to the public, to public interest decision makers is important as well. Thank you.
And it looks like we have to wrap up at this point, but I just want to very quickly thank all the panelists for their really thoughtful responses, especially on those easy questions, and looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.